Hi, my name's Ashleigh Campbell. I'm the Director of NorthSite Contemporary Arts, and welcome to the panel discussion for two amazing exhibitions that we're presenting here at the start of 2022. Deep North by Matthew Stanton and Never So Visible, curated by Davey and Aishah, Kenton. We're here on the lands of the Gimoy Wallaburri Yidinji people and the Yirraganji of the Jabberkai Nation, and I'd just like to take a moment to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and all of the country across Australia on which we're gathered together in this online format. So deep respects, and thank you all for joining us here today. We've just had the opening of these fantastic exhibitions, and we wanted to unpack a little bit more about the artists and these works that are within these exhibitions. These two exhibitions are quite different, but there's some similarities. They're very different in their technical approaches, but really I can see that there's a deep connection to place and people and our interconnectedness in the world. So I'll be handing over to these artists, and we've also got Spiro Miralis joining us from Sydney, who's an artist as part of this exhibition, Never So Visible. Welcome, Spiro.
Welcome. Nice to be here as well.
So I think I'd like to start with Matthew, first of all. Matthew, you grew up in Cairns, in the region, not far from here, in the Valley, Crystal Cascades.
That's right.
You've spent the last 10 years or so documenting the landscape in large format photography, shooting on 8x10 film in the landscape, which I'm sure is no easy feat, lugging this huge camera gear and film around. Can you tell me about what it was and how you came to actually start recording the landscape in this way, and what it now means to be showing this work back here at home?
Yeah, well, look, originally I dabbled in a little bit of colour landscape photography in my late teens. I was mostly photographing my contemporaries and the goings-on of the art scene around Cairns and music scene and the gigs, etc. But I started trying my hand at shooting, trying to photograph the landscape. I wasn't really sure what sort of approach what I hoped to achieve and what sort of approach would be viable for me. And I stopped doing that soon after I moved to Melbourne. Did a little bit of landscape photography in the area surrounding Melbourne, but I think I'd started to think a lot about photographing the landscape initially around the Red Lynch Valley, and then later extending out into the wet tropics region beyond. Sort of around 2006, I think that I was seeing a lot of changes in the landscape, particularly initially. I think I was feeling a bit incredulous that the valley that I knew, which I'd grown up in, each time I would return was looking dramatically different. And, of course, the sugarcane fields, which of course earlier displaced the original vegetation of the valley, were a part of the landscape I knew intimately, and they commingled with rainforest and bushland and floodplains and, all of the topography of the, complex topography of the Red Lynch Valley. And each time I went up, areas where you used to drive that at night were just, blackened sort of forest scenes with the mountains behind were suddenly littered with lights everywhere, and the secret little paths we used to take were no longer secret paths anymore. There were whole communities sort of, lurking along the edge of them. So I guess I was interested initially, probably in maybe more of a nod to the work of some of the new topographers and people like Joel Sternfeld and other photographers who were sort of photographing those sort of changing urban environments in America in the late 70s and 80s, and I saw processes occurring where I grew up that reflected that as well, that I recognised. So it wasn't later until after a few attempts with a smaller, sometimes with a 35mm camera, occasionally with a 4x5-inch camera, that I realised that I needed to dive deeper and spend a lot of time in the landscape and to sort of reflect upon it in ways that I maybe hadn't taken the time to properly do before, and that meant really slowing down and really dedicating myself to try and open up a space in which the familiar could become strange again as well, and to try to find a way to surrender to that experience a bit.
And I see that in your works, and they're so incredibly detailed, and I guess that's as a result of your meticulous approach to photography and a completely analogue engagement with the landscape, and then the way that you print them yourselves, and you just get deeper and deeper. But sometimes I look at them and feel like a stranger in the landscape, and yet then there's these little hints of human occupation, say the freshwater creek bank.
Yeah, Devil's Leap. Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about those little signs within those works?
Yeah, look, there's always little, I try not to make them too overt, but there's always little, I guess, autobiographical nods along the way in some of the images, but I don't make a point of them being conspicuous as that within the images. I guess, I was a part of the process that sort of sculpted a lot of those those landscapes as a child, really. I was implicit in the kind of ongoing degradation of various creek banks along the course, particularly lower in Freshwater Creek, where, look, back in the early 80s, we would spend time, particularly when the creek was a bit higher or high enough, or sometimes just a raging torrent as well, just floating down the creek in tractor tubes, all the way from up at the Cascades, all the way down to sometimes right down near the mouth of the Barron River. And along the way, it was sort of like kind of almost felt like a sort of a Fellini film or something at times. You'd kind of go along and you'd sort of see just all of these like theatres of human life exploding along the kind of creek bank, where suddenly there were, 30 or 40 kids just clambering up and down the banks and leaping off trees, riding their BMXs straight off the edge of the cliff into the water. And so it was sort of, these were the kind of theatres of life for us in a lot of ways. And they were like stages as well along the creeks. The creeks were where life gathered. Freshwater swimming hole down near the Freshwater Bridge between Freshwater and Redlinch was another one. That's where most of our lives played out, really, in the tropics, and out of necessity in many ways, because not many of us were living in air-conditioned homes and just lurking around inside. We were out in the landscape and we were trying to keep cool. So I guess that aspect of it, recognising the role we play in modifying the environment as a part of the process of occupying it. There's a lyricism there, there's a kind of a forlorn melancholy in recognising some of these places that really aren't frequented anymore as well, but sort of, they're kind of like monuments to a particular era that is gone and, is shifted into something new. And, I'm sure kids still have relationships with the landscape that are very, meaningful, but they've shifted in some way, and I still don't completely understand all the ways in which they've done so.
And something I really appreciate about your work, and I learn through your photography, is about the landscape and through that First Nations perspective, and the way, as a photographer from a family of ecologists that have always worked in the landscape and with First Nations Rangers, that connection to country is explored through your work. And we just had an amazing conversation with Vic Bulmer, the head ecologist for Djunbunji Land and Sea Rangers, about the fire practices and the way that you documented that country that they know so intimately. And so I think there's a similarity between these exhibitions and that nostalgia and, you say the theatre of life and where it played out in the landscape and the way that people know that landscape so intimately and well. And then a show like this in Never So Visible, where Sean and Aishah have brought together artists from right across the globe, and through their photography they bring us into their personal worlds that they inhabit. And I think I'd like to talk about perspective and the way that through both of these exhibitions and your works, you bring us back to a very personal view of people's place. And so Sean, perhaps you could just kick off by introducing Never So Visible and some of those key premises in the curatorial rationale that
Sure. Thanks for having us here, and it's good to see Spiro. We catch up less being geographically distant, so it's nice to have you in the room via Zoom. I think Spiro will bring a really interesting personal perspective to his work, and in relation to the some points Matthew's touched on in terms of the usual didactic nature of photography, and also the relationship with other art platforms like film that Spiro is also very engaged with. So I think there's a lot of, even just in those initial remarks from Matthew, I can see that there's a lot of correlation and potential discussion between those two artists at the very least. But in regard to Never So Visible, I think photography for me has always come down to relationships of sort. It comes down to what sort of relationship you have with the subject that you're photographing, rather than an aesthetic desire or a want to produce something for the sake of making art. And I think there's so many visual references that one can take on board, and it's important to navigate those at different stages of your career, take influence from different genres. But I think in the end, personally, I always come back to an overwhelming sense of being moved by art where the photographer is engaged on a personal level with what they're photographing. And that's very much what I hear from Matthew about his connection to the far north. And that's what our curatorial premise with Never So Visible was. The title actually came from an interview that Soham Gupta gave in regards to his work. And we are in this period where there's much more opportunity and spotlight on people from, I guess, more underrepresented cultures, communities, parts of the world in which photography has played a huge role, especially in India. Photography has had a huge cultural and societal importance, yet, you know, in the West, there's only a handful of Indian photographers that you know about. And so during this interview, and Soham gave, I think it was 1854, the British Journal of Photography, he said that his work has never been so visible. It's never so visible as it is now. And that really struck a chord, almost like there are people who have been making work for years, and just because of either geographical or cultural isolation, not being in the West, not being in the view of editors or curators, their work is underrepresented. And it's across gender, it's across social, it's across geographic, the nature of where we look for inspiration from work. And I too, like Matthew, have been really inspired by 20th century American photographers. And you realise why, because that's where most of the visual references have come from. So it's very easy for us to relate to each other over photographers, because a lot of the work that we're shown through books, through exhibitions, is through a very, very narrow perspective. So Never So Visible, it's definitely an exhibition that came from a relationship that Aishah and I have about the discussions of photography, the awareness Aishah has given me in terms of different practitioners and different viewpoints of photography. I'm an Anglo-Australian male with a lot of Anglo-centric influences, blatantly obvious in what we've just talked about. But, you know, it's when you really have personal, meaningful relationships with people and they instill that into you, that it's important to look wider. It's important to form relationships, not token relationships, but really form relationships, even with the potential of nothing practical developing like an exhibition, that starts something meaningful. And the relationships that we have with the photographers in this exhibition really started not with the idea of an exhibition, but long before that, in terms of we felt something in each other's work. And so we did start this exhibition with people whose work we were drawn to, with people themselves who we were drawn to, who we wanted to work with, and also people who had a relationship with photography that was intimate in the nature of their practice, whether it's been the landscape, their community, their relationships themselves, or as Spiro has made, his work is from Italy, but made on a holiday, if you will, with a friend of his and his friend's family. But the intimacy goes beyond just the relationship with subject. What I see in Spiro's work is the intimacy and relationship with the medium itself, and an understanding that to photograph intimately, it is to be open to your surroundings without trying to actually attain anything. It's almost a way of letting the ego fall by the wayside and having the intimate nature of photography and letting photography do its thing as a medium itself. So that's kind of where Never So Visible has come from. We also have Cynthia Mahoney Simpson with a beautiful work that looks and refers to her exploration of her own family history through Indian blackbirding and the slave trade with the cane fields of South Africa. So yeah, that's kind of where it came from, and although the work is diverse, we definitely see a real correlation with Matthew's work in terms of a very, very personally vested interest in the subject that he's working with.
And we might get to your relationship and this body of work of yours, Aishah, in a moment, but I'd actually like to hear from Spiro and about your approach to making this body of work and the way that you shoot. Can you tell us?
Okay, yeah, definitely. So, look, I think I came to photography after trying my luck with screenwriting, and I was a little bit frustrated with screenwriting just because it takes quite a long time to produce a film and then to produce a screenplay, and then you move into the production logistics. And at a time, nearly 15 years ago, I had a film that was sitting in Screen Australia, but it never got all the units, all the components together to actually progress. And I was already having conversations with Sean back then. This was 15, 20 years ago. And I was never comfortable with the idea of being a photographer because I never felt represented by single image and that process of taking single images. And so I would just shoot abundantly. And I would shoot with no real concern and no real intention, but I would keep the camera very, very close. In fact, for a period of 6 years, the camera didn't really leave my apartment. And although we're looking at Underpass and it comes from Italy and maybe it looks worldly in some regard, at the same time, I made 5, 6 bodies of work. Some of them are my favourite, and they really are confined to a one-bedroom unit in Annandale. And so I see them as all equals, and they belong to a time that as time moves away from you, you start to realise certain opportunities don't come often. And so that belle epoque, so to speak, has come and gone, and I'm still shooting, and there's lots of films to be edited and things like that. But the great thing about having Underpass, I don't know, 10 years after it was shot in front of me now, is I'm not compelled to rush the other work, even though it's been shot, sequenced, laid out, and is in a dummy book. I don't feel that there's an urgency necessarily, because one thing that I've realised is that only the process makes the sort of work that I'm happy to look back on 10 years later. Some people will say there are some great images in there or some strong images, but I don't really see the images at all. I don't see them individually, definitely. And I only see their worth in a collective sense, and that is that they've really invited people into a time and a place that can't be again. I can't be that photographer again. At the time, people in those photos were alive. They're no longer alive. And I was just responding to people. I was invested in my friendship. It took me to Italy. I was on my way to see my grandmother who was dying. And I don't think there's any photos of Greece in that sequence, but there certainly is in the body of work. But I was just open to the fact that, I would come home and there would be an editing process, and none of the things that produce the photos would be involved in the editing. I would throw all that sort of stuff out the window and just look at these images as if they weren't mine, as if they weren't my loved ones, my family, my friends, etc. And just look at them long enough to say which image stays open after I've exhausted narrative. Because if I looked at an image and thought, oh, look, there's a forlorn figure in a lonely landscape, and that's exactly what it was, I'd actually toss it out. It had no further interest in me. So I really needed to look beyond that and question the images and pull out the stuff that stayed open beyond the questions that I could ask, and separate them from the humongous amount of images that were taken. And then when I had those 50 or 60 images, I tried to write the same way somebody does a screenplay or a novella or somebody shoots a film. Here are these images that are bigger than their individual worth. How now do I become an author, or how now can I say something more intelligent with them? Because unfortunately with photography or the spoken word, once it's out, it forms part of a narrative. And if you put two images next to each other, whether you like it or not, you've created a sequence. And that sequence will activate a response. And so I wanted to leave it open enough that the viewer was more important than the photographer. But I also wanted to hone in on some of the bigger themes or the more broader themes that I've been engaged with, in music, in screenplays, etc. Just my general disposition on life. And so, it was a funny process, and it's always there's a lot of self-reflection. Sometimes you feel silly, that you have these intimate moments or moments that come from a very close part of your life, and yet you're throwing them on a floor in an order that's trying to say something intelligent. So the people that do engage, when they engage, their response with the medium is absolutely the worth of the medium. Once the sequence is laid down, I really think me as the photographer and me as the writer is redundant, and so I was very concerned that the sequence and the images were open images, so the viewer is really the author at that stage of that experience between them and the images. And so that is the approach that I've sort of tried to maintain in photography. You don't always succeed. I think you'll get to the end of a body of work and it'll sit up against other bodies of work, and you'll just decide that it's just not good enough and you don't need to put it out. But with Underpass, I felt a strong connection with it right away, and I've maintained a very strong connection with it since then.
And so you shoot on film prolifically day to day. And you wear, I hear from Sean, as a good friend of yours and fellow photographer, you wear the camera and often just shoot and shoot. How many, once you've built that sequence, do all the rest of the images become redundant, or do they form new bodies of work and narrative years down the track?
No, look, they may well and truly one day, but I doubt it. I like to move on, and I think you can revisit a work endlessly, but I think ultimately, you run the risk of hitting the same beat over and over again. And I think, because I'm closer to 50 now than I am 40, there's not too many things that I am compelled to say So if I'm going to say something, I think it needs to be considered in the sense that time is of the essence, and time of the viewer is more important than my time. So I don't want them necessarily going through 5 or 6 bodies of work that really is one body of work reinterpreted, because if there is an underlying theme or there's a message, why would I want to water it down or soften it, or why would I want to revisit the same beat? Although it's nice to visit the same beat if it's nuanced, but if it's not, if it's achieving the same effect, I generally believe that a sense of economy is for the best of everyone.
Absolutely. And Aishah, thinking about your move to Australia and your broad interest in photography, and then meeting Sean and this body of work that you're showing here, can you tell us a little bit about that scale of place and body of work you're showing?
5815 is the body of work that's at NorthSite currently, and that body of work came from a place of love in the beginning of our relationship. I mean, we started photographing us and our relationship even before we were romantically involved, so as friends. So the action of taking photos of each other, passing the camera around was always there. And this body of work only came about kind of collectively after we left Canberra and the 1-bedroom apartment which this body of work was made in. And yeah, it's really, I kind of worked on the body of work, like even when we were in the apartment, and kind of looked at it, but it was only till I removed myself from that environment and put myself in a completely whole new environment was I able to actually take a step back and look at the work and piece it together.
And I hear similarities with Spiro, you describing your process and that active sequencing and looking and really considering what each image is saying and how they speak to one another. Sean, in the work of Soham, so he was a really key artist for the both of you in informing this exhibition. You reached out to a number of artists, and I think it's been really lovely to watch Sean and Aishah curate this exhibition and see how naturally and beautifully the relationships are between the artists. And no one's been too precious. They've given you a lot of trust in presenting their work and printing it and showing it, sometimes in Australia for the first time. Could you tell us about Soham's series in this room beside us here, please?
Soham Gupta is a young photographer who's had a bit of an astronomic rise in the international art scene since he first published his book from this series called Angst in 2018, I believe, with the publisher Akina Publishers based out of Europe. And he actually attended a bookmaking workshop, and he brought this work. And from that workshop, the publishers who were running it really fell in love with it and published a book. And it was nominated for some international prizes, and it was in a stage where I was it was kind of on the decline of my book frenzy buying days for the last number of years. I've been quite obsessed with buying photography books, but it was kind of towards the dying days of probably towards financial ability decline, so my interest declined a little bit. But they released 2 versions of this book, a collector's edition and a regular edition, and they were handmade and they were beautiful objects, and straight away something about the work spoke to me in its originality, in its approach, its closeness to subject. And also, Soham did cop a bit of flack from Indian press about using people from the streets, marginalised people, vulnerable people from society, homeless people, a lot of whom have mental illness, a lot of stigma around surrounding them and their communities. And I never felt that from his work. When I saw his work, it was a connection that I felt that was stronger than all of that criticism. And that's always stayed with me. I've never seen the work as opportunistic. I've never felt the work has an ulterior motive apart from somewhat of a soul searching of the photographer himself. And when we met online through Instagram and started talking, and I was reading some interviews of Soham's, it became quite clear, and he's extremely articulate about all of these things, about his connection to these people who's photographed in these marginal communities, marginalised communities. And I just, like all photography and human relationships, you rely on your gut instinct and intuition with people. And there was something about this work, still to this day, that feels very honest, that feels very open, and it feels very self-reflective. And it feels very collaborative with the people in the photographs. And all those things really, for me, build up to a body of work, as Spiro said, that is kind of bigger than the sum of its parts. It has something else that it delivers. And every time I look at the work, yes, we're confronted by people who have mental illness, especially in the slideshow in the gallery. We're confronted with a 100-image slideshow, but still I see empathy at the front of his work. And for me, there are themes that come and go. As like Spiro said, we have recurring themes. I think, Spiro, once you've said, in our lifetime as artists, we probably have maybe 3 or 4 issues that we deal with repetitively. Like, thinking you've got any more than that is, it can be on the egotistical side, thinking you've got the ability to address more than that. Maybe you'd like to address that, but I see empathy as a key one, one that's universal. There's empathy in Matthew's work, there's empathy in Aishah's work, there's empathy in Spiro's work, there's certainly empathy and a love for a place in Ovidio's work, Zumo from China, the empathy, and Sanchintia's. I mean, the empathy for family and her grandmothers who were brought over from India to work on the cane farms of South Africa. There's huge empathy there. And for her, without wanting to put words in her mouth and speak for her in her absence, that's probably something that she will use in her art for as long as she's making art. These are really big sort of themes, and at the heart of them is an empathetic approach. And I think all successful artists, successful in the framework of having something that connects with an audience, I personally feel that empathy is at the core of that.
And I see in all of these works empathy and intimacy, but honesty and a rawness. And so through photography, these artists are giving people a direct insight into their lives and their perspective. And I was looking at the work of Zumo's as you were speaking, and I believe it came about through another love of book, and you've printed it in book form as large 8-metre reels on the gallery wall. And with Aishah's work too, it's really quite personal and giving the viewer an insight into life. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship and your...
Yeah, totally. I think, especially 5815, I feel as though a lot of people would feel uncomfortable with looking at the work, and I'm totally fine with that, obviously, because it's a lot of intimate moments. It's intimacy out kind of in a private space now, in a public space. But to me, as a woman, being able to photograph my partner, so in a vulnerable space, is quite empowering, and also to show it. Just to be able to show it in the public, totally empowering as well. To me, it is intimacy and intimate moments, but everyone, in our life, we go through that. And the difference, I guess, is, a lot of people keep those images on their phones, but here, it's in the public space.
And with Zoo's work, it's like opening the family photo album, and, we get this insight there. And I think these works are so different to some of, the fads or popular movements in photography, particularly, with that really polished, really, sharp, commercial kind of photography. And I've heard Spiro, you kind of describe yourself as an anti-photographer, or is that correct? Like not actually existing within those canons of perhaps mainstream photography?
Well, I whether I'm an anti-photographer or not, the one thing that's certain is I've had no education in photography. and that's something I'm very adamant to maintain. So what I mean by that is none of the skills required to make kind of the photography that is acceptable or comes with an invoice has been within my realm of photography. Apart from picking up a camera and shooting, there's been no other education. The education that I maybe associated with photography has probably come from film, literature, painters and stuff like that, because outside of the medium, everyone tries to do something, whether you're writing song lyrics or whether you're thinking about a little short film, or whether you're, penning your first novel. Ultimately, you're just using stuff to convey a theme or something that you feel passionate about. And so when I think of photographs, I don't look at the skill of the photographs at all. In fact, most of those photographs happen. And if I was thinking about what the image would look like, it's certainly not what the image I got. So those photos in front or behind you are just my collection of miscellaneous items. And it's just in the developing of every image that I take that they exist. Otherwise, if I selected images off the negative, all that education that I think I may have, or all that expectation that sometimes you're not even aware of, would lead me to certain images and discard all the others. But I don't. In fact, all the neg goes off to the lab and they give me little images of everything. And so it's no different from opening up a dictionary at that stage and saying which words resonate. And from the words that resonate, how can I make a poem? And so I don't think of photography ever when I'm doing photographs. In fact, I try and stay away from photography as much as possible. I only think as photography is the means to an end. If I don't have photographs, well, then how can I sequence anything? And so what I do is I shoot a lot and I develop everything. And then from there, I try and put images down and make some kind of message or create some kind of theme. And so if that extends to the full reach of photography and the medium of photography, that's my association only with photography. If somebody asked me to take a photo of them, I really am not the good person to ask at all. I'll pass the camera straight to somebody else.
I remember when you photographed a friend's or a cousin's wedding once with black and white film, and very soon after Spiro said, I'll only photograph it if you actually get a professional photographer to do as well, because I don't want to be responsible for the wedding album. Spiro went around the dinner table with his little black and white point and shoot camera photographing this wedding, people's feet, dirty plates, the waiters, all sorts of things, blurry people dancing. And the wedding album came back from the professional photographer and it was beautiful. And Spiro made a small album of photographs which were all blurry and grainy. And tell me if I'm incorrect, but the groom said, Spiro, these are awful. These are just like, what is this? Oh my God, what have you done? A year later, they talked again, and he said, you know what? We never look at the professional photographer's album. Your album is what we remember, captures the spirit of the wedding. And I just think that's a really succinct example of how photography can creep up on you, and how what you think has been important to photograph, what you think has been important aesthetic values, very quickly fall away, and the essence of something that you got from that wedding is something that the couple felt. It just took them a little while to get there.
I think that's kind of than 1 year. In fact, I thought I lost them for the first year because I certainly wasn't invited to any dinners after the wedding. And I think by the time they reached out to me to say nice things about the album, the marriage was almost over. So, but they're still together, kind of, and they're still very fond of my work. But I want to go back to something Sean said, and something I think the photographers in this exhibition, and definitely Matthew as well, is that when we do give over an image, effectively what we're saying is that this image is open and free of all these sorts of things that people are talking about that can make photography, genre, all these sorts of things, movements, modernism, all these sorts of things. And somehow the image in front of us somehow escapes all of those pigeonholes and somehow still remains open long enough for the person in front of it to actually bring what they feel in their life to that image. And I think it's really hard as a photographer because you think, yeah, but I've just got a really nice, good-looking image. But if someone's looking at it and they can't bring their own life to it, you don't have an image, you have nothing. Because if an image can't engage conversation, and it literally needs to be from the viewer, not the photographer's got to be smart enough to select the ones that can do that. But if the viewer can't engage it, then it's, like all those cliches, what happens when a tree falls in the woods and stuff like that. It's actually redundant. And so quite often, I get a lot of people that don't like a lot of my images or don't like the sort of images that I like. But I hear from people time and time again. In fact, the gentleman that I was travelling with, who I stayed with, hated that body of work behind you. He had nothing good to say about it. And he was a little bit upset for a long time because his father died shortly after we got back home to Australia. And I didn't really have any of the images of his father that he would have liked. But that was before. But after his father died, he really became attached to that body of work. I mean, he would actually ring me and say, can you bring it over? Can we look at it together and stuff? And some of the things that he mentioned to this day have struck me. So I've got some images of unmade beds, and it's just a recurring theme of mine for some reason. And he loathed it. He couldn't understand it. He used to look at these images and just think, one day you'll be a real photographer, but keep at it. After his father died, he would just cry looking at that image because he stayed on to nurse his father to death. And he just thought, wow, everything beyond the love and everything beyond a family and everything beyond sometimes comes down to the simple movements of moving people off beds because they've soiled themselves, changing bed sheets, getting up and just not having the time to make a bed. And he could never see that before his father passed away. And since his father's passed away, he doesn't like to look at it for a whole bunch of other reasons. But the reality is I maybe created a photo of an unmade bed, but the photo was open enough that somebody who had nursed their own father to death looks at that image and brings all this history to it. And I'm redundant in that exchange. All I've done is selected the photo. He's actually brought the discourse. And I think from my own view, I go for a lot of exhibitions where the photographer or the artist, or I read books, etc., where they've brought the discourse. Therefore, there's nothing I can bring. They've made something that's so restrictive and closed that really I don't need to read that book, or I don't need to see that show, or I don't need to view that film, because everything they want to say has been said and there's no movement around their narrative. And so if I choose images from my body work that don't appear to be strong or don't appear to really hammer a theme home, it's because I've looked at them and I've approached all the themes that are possible. And if they can survive my narrative and they can still give back to me, then I think, whatever I feel about an image aesthetically, or it doesn't matter. This is an image that remains open. It's a gift. And so ultimately I'll try and write the language from those images. And I won't worry too much about what is written, if that reflects me theme, style, genre. I won't care about those things because I think the image, the selection of images will convey a message that is very, very deep and passionate to me. And that, hopefully, when it goes up on a wall 10, 12 years later, someone stands in front of it and goes, my God, that's my family at that dinner table. And and there's some hierarchy there, and we don't always love each other, and I can see that in the fruit salad, things like that. So that's very much what I try and do. And so a lot of things that people like to talk about when they talk about photography don't resonate strongly with me. I just think the viewer is the only person that can enrich the image in front of them. So my job is to make it an image that will allow that only and leave the rest up to them.
I think you certainly achieved that with your work, and thank you so much for sharing these insights and this work with us here at NorthSite as part of this exhibition. And Matthew, Deep North is an incredibly powerful body of work. You have a similar, but from a different perspective, issue with shooting on film, and some of the works in here that you've printed by hand, large scale in the darkroom, you can only pull one print of. So do you have your own personal nostalgia, I guess, for taking that image at that time? And
yeah, I think that I remember making nearly every image really well, because often, for various reasons, I would spend a lot of time in one place. Sometimes, just with the dark cloth over my head, panning around the landscape, looking at the ground glass and seeing the images that sort of panned across the screen. And then, stopping and thinking, well, there's nothing really here. This is sort of a fruitless pursuit. And then just hanging around anyhow. So I'd set the camera up, and then after a while, things would reveal themselves to me. Maybe the light would change a little bit. Maybe I would start to see relationships reveal themselves that immediately weren't apparent. Sometimes, just the breeze would blow in a particular way, and it'd sort of, shift something. I couldn't really say, but you spend long enough in certain environments, and then you look for such a long time preempting the exposure, and it is a sort of you do become quite embodied within that environment over time. You're listening to the sound field and the space that's kind of defined outside of the image area. You're looking at movement within the scene. You're looking at where one type of vegetation ends and the other begins, and you're starting to ask all of these questions about what those relationships mean. And also, I guess it's, there's an element of time is really critical to the images, not just the preparation and shooting and sort of thinking and waiting to expose the film, but within itself, the exposures are very long exposures. Often, sometimes, not always, sometimes only a couple of seconds. Sometimes, 2 or 3 minutes. Even moderate light levels, there's the element of time that's sort of an absorption. So there's the absorption within an environment which the process sort of just forces you to do. I mean, it's kind of, you just get too tired to keep picking the camera up and moving it around. So it's like, so there's that side. But also, it's an excuse just to linger somewhere where otherwise you might compel yourself to move on. So I have, there's a lot of strong evocations attached to each image in terms of the period surrounding which the image was made, pulling the dark slide out, and even just the time in which the exposure lapses is a duration in itself, and it's quite a spacious field of its own within which things happen. The wind will raise and lower, vegetation will move, things will go out of index or lose their indexicality in some places, whereas other things are very really critically rendered in their detail. And that sort of surrender and letting the elements sort of just introduce themselves into the image in unexpected ways, letting little accidents occur, are all sort of things that, I do remember it. Of course, in some cases, there's, there's also an element of action as well, like working with the Djunbunji Rangers, the Mendingal-Bayadinji Rangers, working with them in what was really very much a collaborative process, trying to photograph cultural burning on it. It may be a slightly windier day than they would usually be conducted for the sake of opportunity, because it was the first dry day in many months. And working with a 2 or 3 second exposure, which I needed to do because of the way I'd rated the film and the pool processing and a number of other things to try and get the right contrast. There's a sort of really intensely vivid memory of sort of the elements, the reaction with the living world, the biological world that, fire depends upon, occurring around me, and the potential of being in the path of it, but also this little dance that took place between myself and the rangers and their points of ignition and where the wind was blowing and, where I needed to anticipate to be, combined with the demands of the medium, which worked completely against the situation. And that was one of the most enlivening, really one of the most enlivening experiences I've ever had, working in that way, totally almost comically absurd approach to making those images that also felt like the only approach that I could bring to it that would seem appropriate as well. So
sounds like a really almost photojournalistic approach, but with a 10:8 camera.
Yeah.
It seems quite frenetic, which
it was at times, and I'd have, I'd sort of have to get out of the way because I didn't realise that somebody had sort of set the ground fuels on fire behind me, and they'd call out to me, and the shot I was trying to get, obviously had to be given up and surrendered. But, the thing was that they just also took off because they were, sort of burning their mosaic burns, their patch burns along the sort of grassy woodlands all along the sand plain heading north, and they couldn't be bothered waiting for me after a while. They said, we'll see you up at the creek, And so I was, initially we were sort of, this sort of almost theatrical, like performative element, that unintended performative sort of process, which I would have loved to have been, able to observe from a distance. But then later it was just me and, these fires, in the right conditions, they sort of just trickle around the landscape. Some keep burning in some areas, and they've got their own. So it's got its own consciousness, and it, all these really complex sort of burn patterns are taking place. And you just also had time to linger and move the camera around and put it down and wait for the fire to sort of travel through the vegetation into a position where maybe an image could occur. You had no idea, but you also at the same time got a sort of a quickening of the heart when you made an exposure, because it felt so unique, and often you were fairly conscious that you'd gotten something special as well. So.
It's a magnificent series of works, and it's beautiful to have two from that series with those rangers in Deep North printed here in Cairns. So I hope over the next week or two that you get to, as you head out and continue the Deep North series, have those moments of excitement and pensive respite in the landscape, and we look forward to seeing Deep North extend. But I'd like to thank you very much for participating in this exhibition and bringing it to Cairns and sharing with us.
Thanks so much. It's been really just a wonderful experience to be able to bring the images home and share the gallery complex with such a sort of subtle, nuanced and compelling collection of images by artists from all over the globe. It's been, really beautifully created, and to have a home audience, to be able to share these images with a home audience was, at times intimidating, because I felt like I probably, wouldn't have the exotic sort of regard with which Southern audiences would often view the work, because it was unfamiliar to them. So it's been really interesting to be able to bring it to a local audience and and just sort of, see if it stands up, in its home context.
It definitely does. It definitely does.
Definitely.
And thank you, Sean and Aishah. Have you got anything else that you'd like to add for any of the artists that we might not have covered this afternoon? I would like to thank each of the artists that have participated in Never So Visible.
Totally. I feel as though it's such a privilege to bring international artists, especially to a regional gallery here in Cairns, especially with COVID, where you don't have accessibility to that, and to have the artists, and for them, it's very special to be shown in Australia, and for the first time too, for Soham and Zumo and a video. It's a great privilege. Yeah.
Thank you. You've created something really beautiful, and the connections between people, I think, really exchanged with the viewers in this space. So we'll look after it, and I hope that people can experience it online. And please have a look at the beautiful catalogue that Sean and Aishah have created as well. So thank you for tuning in. It's been wonderful presenting this panel. Thank you for your time, Spiro. And
Thank you. Thank you to your guests as well.
Yeah, please check out more at northsite.org.au, and thank you for joining us.